Hey, thanks for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws. Today, we've got a bonus episode for you. It's with my colleague, Annie Oxenfeld. She's a senior director of HR services at Xenium. And with the crazy weather that we've had in the southeastern corner of the United States with the hurricanes, we decided to do an episode talking about how to support our employees who may be experiencing severe weather and disaster and what we can do as employers and colleagues to support them. There's a lot of great tips from Annie and some really good actionable items in here that I think you're going to get a lot of value from. So enjoy the conversation with Annie Oxenfeld of Xenium. Annie, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So Annie and I have worked together a long time, and you're on the East Coast now, and you have been for many years. And the Southeast Coast right now, has gone through a couple really bad hurricanes. And we thought, what a great opportunity to talk about disaster preparedness, relief with employees who may be experiencing, or if your organization may be on in a disaster zone. So let's dive into this. Why do you think it's crucial for companies that have multi-state employees to be thinking about this and to be ready for contingency plans when it comes to these extreme weather events that are super disruptive?
Yeah, it's a great question because they are super disruptive and a lot of them are hard to plan for in advance. So something that we've seen with a couple of these recent hurricanes is just taking different paths than normal. So some communities who don't normally have to deal with this have been impacted pretty devastatingly. And so I think we're seeing some of these events ramp up, and there's all kinds of different events that could happen, from wildfires to earthquakes to hurricanes, tornadoes. And there's probably not one corner of the country that isn't potentially going to be impacted. And especially if you have employees in multiple locations, if you have employees who are working remotely as their only option, like to work at home, the impact of something like this could really be disruptive to the workplace as well and impact multiple employees in ways we haven't really anticipated before.
In your role as a consultant, you work with a lot of different businesses and nonprofits too, across a lot of different industries. A lot of them are based in Oregon, but they have employees all over the place. Have you noticed them asking you about this issue, or is it not even registering with them until it's too late?
Yeah, I think it's coming up in the moment when there's a disaster, and that can be tough to think of everything because at that point it could be a crisis. And you might have employees who don't have power or hard to get in touch with in the moment, or may need to evacuate on short notice. So there's things that I think a lot of employers are not thinking of in advance until it's happening to somebody in their company.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. It's when it's happening in the moment, what can employers do from an immediate step standpoint to check in on employees who may be at risk of being in a zone like this, and maybe they don't have maybe the power's out, maybe they have no internet, and how do they make sure that their well-being they're okay?
Yeah, such a good question. I think as we typically have some warning for some of these events, and so making sure that you're thinking ahead, okay, who do I have in that state or that area, and checking in with them to see what their planning looks like and what they might need for support after the event. I know a lot of states, we have this in North Carolina after Helene, are setting up hotlines that people can call to see if they can check on status of folks that they care about. And so if you're having trouble getting a hold of an employee, maybe their internet or cell service is out, looking for those resources to check in on the well-being of people is a good option. But another good reason to plan in advance for communication strategy is who's responsible to check in with employees. Is it their manager? Is it HR? We don't want to miss the step, right? So ironing that out beforehand can be really helpful to make sure that we're responding promptly.
We know from tons of surveys and just hearing what people want out of their work is flexibility. Not every organization can provide a level of flexibility that an employee desires, But what role does flexibility play in a crisis like this where they absolutely need it? And what would you tell clients who are faced with an employee being in a disaster area?
Yeah. So I think if it's someone who has the ability to work, or if the work can be done remotely from any location, obviously allowing them to do that if they want to work. Some employees may want to work or need to work from a financial standpoint. Others may want to take time to recover, just even psychologically from what they've
Yeah.
experienced, or need the time to seek housing and shelter and things like that. But I think also just being flexible about work schedules. So if somebody needs to take some time out in the middle of the day to go and take care of something, allowing that, and just again, thinking in advance of ways that we could support folks that may need a little bit more flexibility to do their work. Another thing that comes to mind is like payroll advances. So someone who
Hmm.
really needs access to financial means that they were anticipating, that could be something that you could help facilitate too, just being flexible about your pay practices and how that works. Potentially letting folks go into negative on their PTO for these limited circumstances could be a great way to be flexible about your standard policies.
You ever seen employers like offer donations from other employees of PTO or even just add extra PTO in moments of crisis?
Totally. Yeah. And that's something I think is really worth looking at. So I've seen a couple different structures. One is like having an emergency fund for things like
Mm.
this that employees can pay into. And it works really well for large companies. So if you've got people putting in a couple bucks every pay period, it really adds up and people can tap into it and apply for it when something like this happens. Also, the PTO donation is a great thing to do. It gets people involved and lets them feel like they're helping their coworkers in times like this. And then the company itself could have a emergency disaster paid leave program. You can put that in place too. So if someone is impacted by one of these disasters, there's a special bank of paid time off that they would be eligible for. So all of those are strategies to think about for things like this.
I'm no expert in compliance, so that's what you are. You're the expert. Are there any sort of laws, like at the state or federal level, that offers some sort of disaster relief, especially for or leave for somebody who is maybe displaced or literally has no access to power or internet or anything of that nature?
Yeah, I think there's resources available through FEMA, obviously, in those zones that are impacted. And then I think from a protected leave standpoint, it just depends on the state. But that's good to check into and make sure that you're seeing what's available in the state where they're impacted and providing them with that information too.
How can employers who have an employee assistance program, what level of support could a program like that offer an employee going through a situation?
There's a lot of really cool resources available through employee assistance programs. One is just what we usually think of, which is the emotional support, getting the counseling sessions, and that's available to usually the employee and their family member. A lot of them also have financial resource support in terms of how to tap into different available support systems out there. There's other things they can do for you, like researching if you're needing a specific type of support, if you're needing shelter, you're needing emergency services. They can look for those in your area. They can probably help research what's happening on the ground. There's a lot, what I've seen here in North Carolina and beyond with these hurricanes, there's a lot of local community organization support that's happening. And so they can probably help you tap into some of those resources and find that you might not otherwise be available.
What are some ways that employers or even employees of the organization could band together and provide some sort of like tangible aid, care
Yeah.
packages, or something else creative? I'm sure you've heard a lot of ideas in this space.
Yeah, totally. I think this is really important because, especially in these multi state environments where you have a subset of your employees are impacted and others are not, the folks that aren't are probably going to have a concern, maybe even
Yeah.
helplessness. And so, providing some opportunities for them to get involved can be really impactful. For everybody to come together. So I love that idea of care packages, donation drives, even going so far as depending on what kind of company you are, if you're able to donate your services or your goods or your equipment, that can be really impactful to come together and show your support as an organization. I've seen some companies doing like a between the state and the state purchases, if this percentage are going to go towards this support fund. I've seen donation drives organized and coordinated with organizations on the ground to get supplies to people. Like you said, the PTO donation, even just emergency fund. So you could do like a GoFundMe page and circulate that for people who are impacted.
Yeah.
All those things can make people feel involved and like they're making a difference.
I want you to speak to the employers out there. How do you balance as an employer? You got an organization to run, whether it's a for profit or a nonprofit. So you need to keep the wheels in motion. How do you maintain the operations while something maybe very serious is happening with an employee or multiple employees, or a unit of a department maybe is caught in an area of disaster zone? How do you maintain operations, contingency planning,
Yeah.
while also supporting the actual human being?
Yeah, that's such a delicate balance and
Yeah.
why the contingency planning is important. I think we've, especially since the pandemic, we've taken for granted the remote work and how people can just tap into work from home. But if their home is impacted, then so is their workplace. And so some things that come to mind for me are like cross training, making sure that for those critical positions that are remote or in areas that tend to be at risk of natural disasters, making sure that you have a contingency plan in place to still get that work done because we may not be able to rely on those people or that facility to get it done. Other things that you want to balance out are just making sure that you're being flexible and accepting what's happening. So someone may not be able to work that you're counting on to work. And so are there things that you can provide them to get them a little bit more stable? Can you help with emergency shelter or getting them a hot spot or something to help them if they're wanting and able to come back to work, but their current setup is not functional? Because some of this is going to take weeks or months in the recovery efforts. And so we need to be thinking like short term, what are those immediate needs for the person and making sure we're prioritizing those. But then thinking longer term, how do we get them back to work when they're ready and able to? I think it's harder when you've got like a physical location in one of these disaster
Yeah.
zones because that could just be completely devastated and you're having to rebuild. And then you have the issue of, okay, we've got a population of employees who might be ready and needing to come back to work, but we don't have a physical location for them to do that. So, what are our options there with any kind of paid leave or remote work option that we weren't usually thinking about, or nearby locations that we can redistribute people to? So, thinking through some of those contingencies as well.
I'm glad you brought up the physical location, because what I wanted to touch on a little bit, and this is probably a lot to unpack, is when you have a physical location that is in one of these areas of disaster, hopefully you have enough time or advanced warning around one of these things, like a
Yeah.
hurricane. The scientists are really good about measuring where it's going to be and what level it's going to be at. Maybe not a tornado,
Yeah.
maybe not an earthquake,
Yeah.
maybe not a fire that breaks out. How do you, as an employer, make sure that your physical location, your people are safe when disaster strikes?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And there are some things that you can do, creating a disaster preparedness plan, looking at evacuation routes, looking at each of those scenarios that could occur in your area and how you would handle working with the safety consultant is a really smart. And then just making sure that you're planning ahead and who's making the decision. In the case of something where we do have a little bit of advance notice, who's making that call to close the
Mm,
operations for the day or the week or what that looks like, and encourage people to evacuate or do that. And then there's some compliance probably involved as well that we need to be working into those plans. But I think you need to have something mapped out, and then you need to make sure that you're training your team on a regular basis because just once people will probably forget. So keeping it
yeah.
relevant and updated and on people's minds so everybody feels like they know what to do and what to expect if like that does happen. Nothing more stressful than someone feeling, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to come into work today. I can't get a hold of my manager. How do I know if I'm supposed to go in or not on top of this thing that's coming and could happen? So making sure that you're very clear with people up front and that you want them to prioritize their safety,
Mm.
especially companies that have pretty strict attendance standards, making sure that we're always going to prioritize safety. And that could be an individual decision with natural disasters. that we want people to know that they have that flexibility to put themselves first and that there's not going to be repercussions for what would typically be an attendance infraction.
In your experience, are employers pretty good about, I'm sure they have a safety plan. I'm sure they have evacuation routes, but are they good at training employees and reminding them and even reviewing it frequently? Because I don't know, I can recall like I had a couple of college jobs in a production environment. I know they had safety plans. I don't remember ever being trained.
Yeah. It's a lot of times it's like a dusty book somewhere in the
Yeah.
corner of HR's office or something like that. And so safety can often feel like a check the box thing to just, as long as you're in compliance, it's fine. But it really does need to be a culture that you develop inside of your organization
Yeah.
and that you get people at all levels of the organization involved in so that there's buy-in, that people is top of mind. So that is an area that I think a lot of employers miss is just the constant reminders, keeping it top of mind, reviewing, updating, making sure that your new employees are exposed to it as well. So that, like I said, everybody feels prepared because that can often have a real big impact in terms of the level of escalation people feel or stress they feel
Yeah.
around these events is how prepared are they for it?
You said something profound in there that I don't even know if you realized it, but it was about the culture and making safety part of the culture. Like one of our values at Zenium is people first, and that can mean so many different things like safety training and a plan. Caring about the whole human could be just part of that. It could be a very nuanced and technical piece of that, but it's because we care
Yeah. Yeah.
about the people. And I think your point about just making it part of the culture is so valuable if we keep talking about it because we care about the
Yeah.
person and our livelihoods, that it does become ingrained in our everyday practice and how we treat each other
Yeah,
and how we think
absolutely,
about work.
absolutely. And it can even you can even tie it into when things and events are happening in the world that even if they don't impact your employee base directly, still checking in with them to see how they're holding up because it can be hard to see this happening in the world and it can feel good to employees to know that you're thinking about their well-being, but also thinking about their safety if something like that did happen to them or their loved ones. Yeah, I think that's a good point about the tying it to we care because sometimes it can feel a little bit dry or a little bit boring or safety. But if you can infuse it with this is why it's culturally important to us and we're prioritizing you as our people, I think there's some fun ways to do that. I think there's some ways to make it feel a little bit more engaging. And that can be an exciting challenge to think about so that, yeah, people are responding to it.
Annie, I appreciate you coming on. We covered a lot of ground. Did we miss anything that's super important for this discussion?
Let me think. I think we covered mostly. I'm sure there's things we didn't touch on because this is such a big topic, but there's, yeah, a lot to be thinking about and a lot of impact that employers can have in terms of support for employees when they're going through something like this. And so just getting creative and getting more brains in the room to think about what would be impactful for this situation is something I would encourage because really that community is what gets people through a lot of this. And so
Yeah.
employers can absolutely have an impact on how employees experience this.
One of the things that I just thought of was that when you have a culture of communication, open dialogue with a manager, employee, or team, things like this become a lot easier. I
Yeah.
know we have an employee that is in Tampa, and I think she's safe and things are fine. Power might be out, but was very communicative with her, not only her team, but her manager, and just made sure that things were good and taken care of, and then that she was taken care
Yeah.
of too, and that
Yeah.
she was in a safe spot. So I think it is part of that culture. I think there's so much of these like very technical things about HR
Yeah.
that is truly just about human
Yeah.
connection,
Yeah.
and we need to make that part of the culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's well said.
Annie Oxenfeld, I appreciate you coming on the
Mm,
podcast. It's a lot of fun.
thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Zenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Zenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.